So I'm continuing my series of working through 1 Thessalonians with Paul, and this, just to remind you, was probably one of the earliest, if not the earliest, bits of New Testament that was written very early. And Paul had visited this church very briefly on his second journey, and spent about 3 weeks there preaching the gospel, and then had to leave because of opposition. There was a riot that was stirred up, and he made a quick exit, which is probably unlike Paul, but obviously it was felt that it was the right thing for that particular occasion. So as we move forward with it, we begin chapter 2. We looked at chapter 1 over 2 weeks. Chapter 2 begins with Paul, not unusually actually, under attack, or at least he's responding to being under attack. I always feel amazingly sorry for Paul, because he had to face so much in planting churches and in bringing the theology that's the basis of the New Testament that was revealed to him, and being apostle to the Gentiles. And he was constantly under attack from fellow Jews who obviously thought he was completely heretical, from Greeks sometimes, from the Roman authorities, often from other Christians, sadly, as well, and he had to defend himself. And in chapter 2, we see him doing that. He's being discredited and attacked, and probably partly because of his very abrupt departure overnight, and his failure to return. And so probably those Jews that raised up the riot originally from the synagogue were having a go and getting into the church and saying, Paul, he's a charlatan. This is how John Stott wonderfully puts it in his... Oh no, this is the reading. We'll read it first. Yeah. You know, brothers and sisters, that our visit to you was not without results. We had previously suffered and been treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know. That's the time when they were in prison and all the rest of it, and the angel comes to get them out. But with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition. For the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives, nor are we trying to trick you. On the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. We're not trying to please people, but God who tests our hearts. You know, we never used flattery, nor did we put on a mask to cover up greed. God is our witness. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else, even though as apostles of Christ we could have asserted our authority. Instead, we were like young children among you. Just as a nursing mother cares for her children, so we cared for you. Because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel of God, but our lives as well. Surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We worked night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preached the gospel of God to you. You are witnesses, and so is God, of how holy, righteous and blameless we were among you who believed. For you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting and urging you to live lives worthy of God, who calls you into his kingdom and glory. So this is how John Stott, in his good, wonderful commentary on Thessalonians, puts it. He says, by studying Paul's self-defence, it's possible for us to reconstruct their slanders. That's those that were attacking him. He ran away, they sneered, and hasn't been seen since. Obviously, he's insincere, impelled by the basest of motives. He's just one more of those many phony teachers who tramp up and down the Ignatian Way. That was the major Roman road that ran through Thessalonica. In a word, he's a charlatan. He's in his job only for what he can get out of it in terms of sex, money, prestige or power. So when opposition arose and he found himself in personal danger, he took to his heels and ran. He doesn't care about you Thessalonian disciples of his. He's abandoned you. He's much more concerned about his own skin than your welfare. That's a wonderful way of summary of what he's facing. But the great thing is that as Paul puts forward this defence to refute these allegations, he also gives us a guide to what it means to be a good leader. And I don't know whether you think of yourself as a leader or not, but actually we all lead in various capacities in different ways, whether it be at work, in the church, in various different ways, or with our families. We all sometimes have that role of being a role model or a leader or somebody looks up to. And in bringing his defence to these accusations, Paul gives us a picture, a wonderful picture of what it means to be a good leader. So, the first thing a good leader needs is courage. And the opponents are accusing him of cowardice. In verse 2 it says, "We previously suffered and been treated outrageously in Philippi, as you know. But with the help of our God, we dared to tell you his gospel in the face of strong opposition." Paul senses that some of these opposers of his are saying, "Oh, well, he just ran away when the going got tough. He quit and never came back." And that was never true of Paul, as we know from reading the whole of his life and story. That Paul was absolutely fearless in the face of threats, difficulties, death, threats, all sorts of things, and he kept going. And he says here, "Look, I was bold among you. I just had all this opposition and been in prison in Philippi, and yet I still came and boldly preached the gospel, and even though he was then attacked." And to be a leader in whatever sphere, you do need courage. It's not easy being a leader, and for various reasons you will always face opposition. You will face spiritual opposition, you'll face personal opposition, you'll face cultural opposition, and it can come in so many different ways to us. So you need courage to stand against it and not quit. We had an email around from Vineyard UK just this week for a day of prayer tomorrow, this Monday, calling the churches to pray and fast tomorrow, because there's been so many pastors' children that at the moment are under attack, either with serious illnesses, tumours, mental illness, self-harming, not wanting to go to school and all the rest of it. We're quite old as Vineyard pastors. Most of them are younger and got younger families. And there's obviously been so much of this coming to the head office that they realise that there's got to be some prayer, that pastors' families in the Vineyard are under attack. So I'm calling you as well and asking you if you would pray tomorrow. Pray and fast if you feel that's right. But just pray against the attacks of the enemy. And we, Helen and I, can identify with that. Absolutely. Our children are under attack at the moment in various different ways. I don't want to go into detail, but that's true. So you will face opposition, and it takes courage to fight through that and say, "No, I'm not giving into this. I'm not giving way." And we face trouble and difficulties and frustrations. Leading is not easy. You will face difficulties and frustrations, things that don't work out, things that don't happen in the way that you want, and all sorts of trouble in life. And you also face the fact that we are working in the realm of the unseen and the unknown very often. We're having to pioneer things, do things before we see the fruit of it, thinking, is this going to work? I had this sudden idea, which I think is from the Spirit, a few weeks back, about doing this Grow Baby Sunday service. But then afterwards I said, that's a great idea. And I think, nobody will turn up. You know how it goes. You think, we'll put a lot of effort in and no families will come. And it's that sense of attack that you've got to think, okay, it is unknown, it is unseen. I don't know what's going to happen. But I've got to have the courage to press on with it. And so we are taking a risk. I'll look stupid if nobody comes, but then that's I look stupid most of the time, so no difference there. But anyway, so being a leader in whatever sphere it is, even with your families, in your work situations, often it takes a good deal of courage. it takes a good deal of courage, because leaders are always there to be shot down, and Paul knew that only too well. So that's the first thing that Paul faced, was a charge of cowardice. And then he is accused of having really bad motives in various ways, that he's in it for himself, and all his motives are really, really corrupt. So he's just out on the road, taking this message out purely for selfish reasons. So they say, Paul says, for the appeal we make does not spring from error or impure motives. He's being accused of selfish ambition. And in fact, the reason that Stott in his quote mentions sex is because the impure motives word apparently in the Greek has a sexual connotation. So there's almost an accusation, you're just out to bed a few women in the church. And maybe there's some of those few prominent women that became Christians. Maybe you're after them. Anyway, he's accused of all sorts of impure motives. And it's true, of course, that we can do leadership, again, in whatever context, from selfish motives and selfish ambition. But that's not what Paul's doing. He says, I never use trickery. He says, nor are we trying to trick you. Now, we do get tricksters in the church. There are people who sort of try and do conjuring tricks with the Spirit, or pretend in various ways, pretend maybe to get your money for good purposes, but don't. Or there's just a kind of motive behind what they're doing. But Paul says, I never tried to trick you. I was always honest and truthful. So to be a good leader, don't use trickery. Okay, no conjuring tricks, smoke and mirrors and all the rest of it. He says also, and this is a big one, isn't it? We were not trying to please people but God. Paul says, I wasn't a people pleaser. I didn't try and just tell you what you wanted to hear. The trouble with people pleasing, we do want to be liked, don't we? We all like being liked, and it's not that we want to deliberately go out to sort of rub people up the wrong way. That's not what he's saying. But there's a sense in which leaders have that difficult task of not bowing to pressure, or just to getting people to like them, and just trying to please them in what they do. It means you never challenge them or say, that's wrong. And actually, you can never please everybody all the time anyway, because what pleases one person in the church will probably, rub up the wrong way somebody else. So it's not a game you can play very easily. It's a bit of a conjuring trick, trying to keep this plate spinning. I'll keep them happy, keep them happy, keep them happy. So I think actually one of the most difficult things in terms of growing to maturity is not to be a people pleaser. And I'm not there yet, so I'm just owning up to that. But Paul says we weren't trying to please people. That wasn't my aim, he says. I was trying to please God. He says also, we never used flattery. That's another way we get people to do well. This is the definition. The act of praising someone, often in a way that's not sincere, because you want something from them. And there's a fine line, isn't there, between encouraging and genuinely saying thank you for something, which we want to do, obviously, as leaders. We want to do that. But there's this sense of falling over into flattery where you're starting to do it just to get them on your side, or to get something from them, because you want them to do something for you. So don't use flattery. Actually, this just as an aside, this gives me a moment to do my flattery joke. Okay, so there was a guy who had a car, and it was playing up. So he took it into the garage and said to the mechanic, "Can you check my car? It's not working properly." So the mechanic lifts up the bonnet, and inside there's this bat hanging from the engine area. And this bat says to the mechanic, "Whoa, you're a good-looking mechanic, and I really love that boiler suit you're wearing." And the mechanic then turns to the client and says, I see what your problem is. You've got back flattery. Yeah. So, moving on swiftly. That's just to get your attention back, really. He says, greed, nor do we put on a mask to cover up greed. Sadly, of course, we know that from many, many stories in the contemporary church and churches around the world that greed has become something which does motivate some leaders. Paul says, I wasn't greedy for your money. That wasn't what I wanted. In fact, as we know with Paul, he always worked himself, did his tent-making stuff. And he alludes to that in the passage, that I work night and day. He never, although he had a right, he says, I had a right to take money from the churches to support my ministry. I never did it. I always did my own job aside. I was bivocational and spent all the hours that it was to make sure you didn't have to be burdened with it. And then, lastly, he says, praise from people. We were not looking for praise from people, not from you, nor from anyone else. He says, I wasn't in it just to get the glory. Now, so those are the bad motives which he was accused of, and he says, no, that wasn't me. And it's, I guess, to sum those things up, it's about leading out of need and insecurity. So it's that you want the leadership to give you something rather than to be giving it away. And there's all of those things show a certain insecurity. Now I know that, I sense usually that most people who lead and pastors who maybe fall in some of these ways, they don't start out with that intention. It's not that they're kind of, I'm going into leadership so that I can get money or I can get a following or whatever. But somewhere along the way, if those needs and insecurities in your heart are not dealt with, then they will start to surface. And sometimes it can be that it takes over and then it becomes about my position and my power, and people will do all sorts of spiritual abuse in order to keep their position. So we don't want to lead out of need and insecurity. We want to lead out of a different heart. And that's where Paul goes on to contrast this. He contrasts those bad motives with his good motives, and this is his defence. And the first one, of course, is he says, because we loved you so much, we were delighted to share with you not only the gospel, but our lives as well. That's always, in Christian work anyway, is the motive for our leadership. Actually, for us as Christians, it's our motive in whatever context or sphere we are. It's because we love people and we want their best. And that's the hardest thing to do. Sometimes so many of the pressures come in and come against us, and we can just lose sight of that sense of why are we in this? We're doing it because we love people and we love God. Just to remind you, it's a bit revision because I've used this many times before. John Mark Comer's definition of love: the compassionate commitment of the heart to delight in the soul of another and to will that person's good ahead of your own, no matter the cost to yourself. That's agape love, of course. It's not the love as the world defines it, but that's agape, Jesus love. Okay, so he says my motive was love. And he fleshes that out in a couple of illustrations. He says, I was like a nursing mother to you. He says, just as a nursing mother cares for her children, in verse 7. He said, that's the kind of depths that I was prepared to go to you with. You know what it's like with, we've got a good illustration this morning, but even when they're younger, I sense that Paul is thinking of a really young child, probably because the church was very young. It was a baby church, really only a few weeks old. And he's got that sense. You know what it's like when your child, but those of you who've been parents anyway, most of you, you know what it's like when children are young. They wake every 3 hours. You've got to get up and feed them and change them, and it's all of that that routine of going without sleep and working. And Paul says that's what I was like with you. I was going without sleep. I was doing everything I could to nurture you and to grow you as a church. And so that's Paul says that's the motive. And he says, interestingly, also in the passage, he's like a good father as well. He's not just a nursing mother. He's also a good father. He says, for you know that we dealt with each of you as a father deals with his own children, encouraging, comforting, and urging you. And those are those three things at the beginning of verse 12 there: encouraging, comforting, and urging. That's the role of a leader. It's to encourage, to draw people on, to comfort them when they're down or when things have gone wrong, and to urge them on to the best they can be. I rather think those words remind me a bit of an athletics coach, actually, or a good athletics coach, who's constantly encouraging them, saying, do it this way, do it this way. They've got the pride, they've got the idea as well that it's not them that's going to win the gold medal, it's their protege who they're looking after. So they're doing all of that, putting all of that time in for that person to win, hopefully an Olympic gold or whatever. And they do that encouraging, they comfort in times of when the athlete is fed up or injured or whatever. They're there to take them through. And that's what we're there for. Paul is also motivated by truth. He doesn't mention truth specifically, but he mentions this, your witnesses of how holy, righteous and blameless we were. There's a couple of times in the passage where Paul is accused of wearing a mask or the trickery or whatever. But Paul says, no, I want the truth. That's what motivates me. That's what motivates my heart. The truth of the gospel and the truth of the kingdom. And the last good motive that I sense from the passage is just that Paul is always motivated by the Jesus story, or the gospel, if you like. It's the story of the Trinity, really, but it's the Jesus story that motivates him. That's why he's on the road all the time. That's why he's building churches and preaching the gospel. It's because Paul has been captivated by this story of God's creation and salvation. And he's absolutely fixated by it. And it's what drives his life. He says, on the contrary, we speak as those approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel. And I sense that at the end of the day, when things go wrong in leadership, it's probably most of all because we lose sight of that. We lose sight of the cross. We lose sight of this great salvation story that God has put in place to redeem humanity and bring us back to where he always wanted us to be, in his presence and with him, doing life with him. The story of Eden. And he's done all of this great majestic work of salvation to break the powers of darkness. And it's when we lose kind of that as our vision that things start to go wrong. But Paul says, he says, you've been brought into the kingdom and into the glory of God. He said that's where you're headed. That you've been brought into this renewed kingdom where Jesus is king. And one day, when he comes again and recreates heaven and earth together, we know that beauty will be in its fullness. But he says that's what's driving me on. I want as many people as possible to experience that, to experience what it's like to live under the reign of the King Jesus, rather than under the reign of Satan and his darkness, which is where everybody in our world is living. So he's motivated by that kingdom story and by the glory, which we can't even begin to imagine will happen for us one day. The glory we will live in and will radiate from us. So I guess to sum all of that up, Paul says, I'm leading really out of security and completeness and trust. His relationship with his Father and with Jesus is so strong that's what he's leading and working from. Okay, we're nearly done. Just one last one. He was accused of being an idler. But he says, surely you remember, brothers and sisters, our toil and hardship. We work night and day in order not to be a burden to anyone while we preach the gospel of God to you. So as leaders, we aren't idlers. We want to be hard workers. Now that has to have a balance about it. I mean, it's not that we work ourselves into the ground, because that doesn't help anybody. But there's this balance of hard work and times aside, as Jesus modelled for us, where we rest, and we rest well. But nevertheless, there's a sense in which we want to work hard for this. And we know that also it's not just about our hard work, it's about a human-divine partnership as the Holy Spirit prompts us and empowers us. But if you want to be a leader, you've got to be a hard worker. You've got to put the hours in, and you've got to work for the kingdom of God. So that's Paul responding to his critics, responding to accusations of bad motives and being idle and being a coward and just quitting and leaving. And it's a reminder to us that that's the kind of leadership Jesus showed us, and it's the kind of leadership he wants us to be as well.